So, anybody have their rock with them? I have mine. Several times during the week, Rachel kindly said to me, "Go get your rock." I'm not sure why. So as I mentioned last week, we're going to talk more about this passage this week. And I want to tell you something that I think you probably didn't know. But in order to get to that, I want to go through some other things first. So I hope you brought allergy medicine, because we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. Just what everyone wants to hear. But I do have a PowerPoint, so that will help. So we want to crank the PowerPoint up, please. All right. Pardon? No. Just like my thoughts. Yes. Either one works. We're going to talk about what they call gospel transmission. And that is how the gospel got from its, any particular gospel, got from its original state, the very first time it was written down, to what we know today. And that actually works for any of the books of the Bible too. But particularly we'll be talking about Gospels. Now, when I was in Sunday school a very, very long time ago, they started trying to teach us this. I remember Mrs. Kieselhorst talking about it. I remember other teachers as they got older talking about it. And the process that they described how the Bible got written was this. It started with God, of course. Next slide. And then God inspired a person. Realistically, inspired a man to write. And as our Sunday school teachers told us way back when I was a kid, inspiration in this case meant that God was basically like leaning over the shoulder of the writer and telling him what to write. And then they in turn turned around and put it, next one, on parchment or leather or whatever they had to write with. And after they were done, after God had told them everything that they should write, and they were done with that book, next one, then it got to be part of the Bible. I'm a little hazy on that part, at least I was back then. You know, it was like they collected all this stuff and then they sent it off to Cokesbury and it became the Bible. But there was more to it than that. How it actually was, next slide please. Again, it starts with God, of course, because God is the inspiration to the Bible. And it starts with God inspiring for the Bible a number of writers. Next one. And our understanding now is that inspiration is not dictation. It's not the same. Inspiration is God, the Holy Spirit of God, entering into its writers and saying, you know what? You've had an experience. You've had an experience of the divine. You've heard things. You've seen things. In the case of the New Testament, he's talking to followers of Jesus and saying, God is saying, you have heard and understood new teachings. So write them down. Next one. And they did. There were many, many different books. There were even many different Gospels. We're familiar with 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There were more than that. Because what happened next is all of these books And this was happening around 3, 4, sometimes 500 AD. Those councils were made up of scholars and bishops and other types like that. And they looked at these books that were presented to them, and they asked questions. They said, okay, how does this fit with our tradition of faith? How does this fit with what we know about God? How does this fit with our understanding? Does this make sense? As a quick example, there was one gospel that was written about the early childhood days of Jesus. And it had the early Jesus molding birds out of clay and then turning them into real birds. Doing things like that. And that didn't really fit with tradition as we know it, so that gospel was never included. But the ones that did fit, next slide, became part of the Bible. Now on to the next one, okay? Now we'll talk particularly about gospel transmission. Particularly, we'll talk about John. Once again, God inspired the author of the Gospel of John. In all likelihood, as we believe today, scholars believe, it was not actually John the disciple. Because the book was written a little too late for that. It was probably a follower of John the disciple. And this was not uncommon in those days, that followers of a particular teacher would name the book after that teacher. It was a way of honoring them. It was a way of saying, this is who I'm actually writing for. So it was probably some disciple of a disciple that wrote it. And then he finished this book. And it was important to have a book like this because at that time, early Christianity was kind of in a Wild West phase. Because they were still trying to figure out who they were and what they believed. So you had all of these churches that had sprung up in different places in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean. And because they were all at some distance from Jerusalem, they all had their own beliefs. Similar, but different. So it's important to get books out to these people to show the core beliefs, the core understandings. So John, the author of the Gospel of John, would have looked at the book. He would have said, you know what? I think this is good stuff. So I want to send it out. And then he would give it. In this case, we're going to say he's going to send it to 2 churches. He's here to 2 churches that need this information. So he gives it to somebody. We call him Xerox. Good Greek name. He said, hey, Xerox, make copies of this for me. But of course, no copy machines, no printing press, nothing like that. So making a copy of the gospel meant some poor guy had to sit down at a desk and handwrite the entire gospel. Letter by letter, word for word, line by line, copy the whole thing. If we're going to send out 2 copies of it, we've got to do it twice. And he sends it out to a church, or these 2 different churches. Next one, please. And those 2 different churches receive the gospel, and they read it, and they study it, and they think, this is the greatest stuff, since sliced bread. And the people there say, hey, I want a copy of it. Which means, again, it has to be written. Letter by letter, word by word, line by line. Every copy of the gospel. Every time someone wants a copy, it has to be handwritten. You ever play telephone?
Yeah. Yes.
So you know that from the source to where it ends up, there's likely to be some change. And it's the same with the gospel. Every time it gets written down, that introduces an element of change, or at least a chance of change. It might be simple, it might be a matter of leave out a letter, leave out a word, but that risk of change is there in the transmission. Next slide, please. So eventually, though, there are many, many copies of the gospel floating around. All of them slightly different. So it then becomes the job of somebody to determine which one is the correct one. Which copy of the gospel is going to be selected and said, this is the one we're going to put in the Bible. So that's where it's going to end up. Next slide, please. That's where we want to be. But which one of those? And it's not a trivial question. Next slide, please. We know there were at least 160 different copies of the Gospel of John. We know that because scholars today have identified at least 160 different copies of it. There are some complete copies, but given the age, 1700, 1800 years, most of what they have is fragments. And some of those fragments are like this. But they can look at it and they can say, oh, I see these words in it. And I know the Gospel of John, so I know that this is from the Gospel of John. So 160 plus copies floating around out there. Which one's right? If you want to get to the right copy, you want to go to the very earliest edition you can possibly find. Next slide, please. So you're going to look in this time frame from right after the original gospel was written until maybe 400 or so AD. And sure enough, scholars have identified two. Next slide. They're called Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 75. If you want to be hip, you call them P66 and P75. Those date back to the late hundreds, early 200s. And they're complete copies. They're nearly complete. There's some missing verses here and there. They're nearly complete. Next, please. This is what P66 looks like. That's the first page. And look at that. And I'm astounded to be looking at something that is 1,800 years old. A copy of something written by John, or by the author of John. And it's amazing that it's preserved, and that is a miracle in itself. And then you look at it closer, and you think, holy mackerel, how did they ever read that? Because if you notice, ancient Greek, the way it's written, there's no words in it. It's all just letter after letter after letter after letter, row after row after row. So if you can imagine somebody sitting at a desk copying this, okay, delta, delta, sigma, A, alpha, how does that not go astray? Next one, please. Should be next one. Two more almost full copies. Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. A codex is like a book. It's individual leaves of parchment or papyrus bound together. These are nearly complete copies as well. Those date to around 300 AD. And then there's one more from this era that's a nearly complete copy. Next one. And that is the Codex Bezae from around 400 AD. Now, the reason I tell you this, I hear eyelids snapping shut up there. The reason we got to this point is that the Codex Bezae, written 400 years, around 400 AD, copied around 400 AD, a full 250 years after the first. The Codex Bezae is the first Gospel of John that has the story of the woman caught in adultery and Jesus. The older copies do not. Next slide, please. And now you're thinking, what the heck? How does something like this happen? How do we have a gospel that has a story suddenly added to it? And there's three possibilities. The first is that whoever wrote that Codex Bezae decided, hey, I think this would make a good story to explain how Jesus worked. And just made it up and put it in. That's a little disconcerting. The second possibility is that it was from oral tradition. That it was a story of an encounter that Jesus had that just got passed down by oral tradition, was never written down until finally some guy, when he was copying the gospel in 400 AD, said, you know, I've heard this story, and I think it would fit very nicely right here. So he adds it in. Is the story true? Well, he's not sure. And then the third possibility is that there are even earlier copies than we know of that actually have that passage in it. But that in the copying process, in the transmission process, somehow it got dropped. Maybe that page fell out of the book when they were handing it off. Who knows? And that one kind of has some traction, because if you think about the idea of this free-floating story there, you then understand why there are other copies of the Gospel of John that have that story at the end of the Gospel. And that even explains why there is a copy of Luke that contains that passage, which no other copy of Luke has. So we're left to wonder, how did it get there? More than that, we're left to wonder, what does this mean? How does it affect my understanding of the story? How does it affect my understanding of what Jesus was teaching? I think those are really good questions. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. So until then, I encourage you to think about this. Think about what it means to you to know that maybe the story never happened. Or maybe it did. Either way, what does it mean to you? We'll talk more next week.